Hello there, everybody. Just as a kind of general overview of Act Two, or a general review before your Act Two quiz, which will open on Friday. This is just my general breakdown of Act Two, kind of similar to what I did over Act One. I'm going to just try and go as fast as I can, go through it all, hit all the highlights, because, again, there's a lot and a lot happened. So, Act 2, Scene 1, really short scene. So it takes place immediately after the end of Act 1, where we have Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio making their way home from the feast of the Capulets. And on the way home, Romeo decides to effectively ditch Benvolio and Mercutio and go back to the Capulets to try and go see Juliet, who he has just met at the party and is already madly in love with. So that's what Romeo decides to do. After Romeo takes off, Mercutio and Benvolio look for him a bit, don't really know where he goes. They assume that he's gone off to effectively sulk, or essentially sulk and continue moping over Rosalind. And basically they decide to just go home and just leave him by himself. And that's scene 1. Scene 2, also known as the balcony scene. So Romeo sneaks into the Capulets' orchard, which is underneath of Juliet's bedroom window. And it's there he sees Juliet again, gives his famous soft "What light from yonder window breaks" monologue. And he also overhears Juliet say some pretty interesting and important stuff. And notably, Juliet does not initially know that Romeo is down in the orchard, so she says stuff that she does not intend for him to hear. So, first off, Romeo learns that she is also in love with him, and he overhears her mention how her great concern is effectively that their names. She wishes that Romeo weren't a Montague or that she weren't a Capulet. And Juliet muses a bit on almost the worthlessness of names and how insignificant names really are, using a rose as an example. She gives the example, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Basically mentioning or saying that what we call a rose, but if we were to call a rose something else, it wouldn't change anything else about it. It wouldn't change how nice it smells or that it looks pretty. Its main characteristics would stay the same. So the name really means nothing or signifies nothing about it. And it's right around that point when Juliet is musing about names that Romeo reveals himself to her, and they both profess their love to each other, or for each other. Although Juliet is a bit embarrassed that Romeo overheard what she said. And she makes an interesting demand, or just like statement, where she tells Romeo that things are moving pretty fast, but as long as he's serious, she's fine with that. But to prove that he's serious, the next step for them is marriage. So to that end, basically, she tells Romeo that if he is serious about being in love with her and about wanting to marry her, then he needs to go out and make plans for them to get married, and she will send somebody to go and talk to him the next day, so that he can fill them in on the plan and they can tell her what to do and how they can basically be together. And Romeo says, okay, and he goes off, and that's when we get to Act 2, Scene 3, where we're introduced to the character of Friar Lawrence. Now, Friar Lawrence is a priest, although he's specifically a friar. So what that means, he's not really a preacher per se. He's more of a monk. So he does a different, more general work for the church. Friar Lawrence seems to specialize in stuff like healing, so he's kind of a healer, and he's also implied to be a teacher, and it's implied that that's how Romeo knows him. Seems that Friar Lawrence was one of Romeo's teachers, and that basically they've remained close, and Romeo still views him as like a mentor figure and has still gone to him for advice. But recently he's gone to speak to him about Rosalind, asking him for advice about what he should do about her, and telling him about how he's in love with her, and just kind of whining about Rosalind to Friar Lawrence, kind of similar to what we saw him do in Act 1 to Benvolio and Mercutio. Anyway, so when we are introduced to Friar Lawrence, he is out gathering herbs to use to make medicine out of. But he has a really interesting monologue here that kind of establishes and develops some significant themes of the play, and builds off this theme that was kind of established in Act 1 of how it's possible for things to be both good and bad at the same time. And specifically in Act 1, they look at it looks at how love can be both good and bad. It can be good and bad, where it can be this positive, uplifting, creative force that brings joy, or it can be this negative, destructive, kind of misery-inducing force that just brings pain. In this case, Friar Lawrence uses this example of these herbs that he's gathering to illustrate that concept, mentioning how if they're used properly, they're medicine and they have healing properties, but if they're used improperly, they're poisonous, and basically you'll die if you use them, if you take them improperly. And he comments on how it's kind of like that with people too, how people also have the capacity to be good and evil, and that really it comes down to the choices that people make. Basically, Friar Lawrence is commenting how all people have the potential to be good or evil, and whether or not a person does good or evil comes down to ultimately what choices they make. But then Romeo comes in, and Lawrence is concerned that Romeo is there. It's very early in the morning, Lawrence infers correctly that Romeo has not slept. So basically, Romeo came right to go see him after leaving Juliet's. It's very early in the morning at this point. And when Friar Lawrence basically asks Romeo, like, have you been up all night? Romeo responds, yes, he's been up all night, but he's had a very pleasant evening. And Friar Lawrence immediately infers that, oh my God, you spent the night with Rosalind, and starts to get a bit concerned and arguably a bit angry at Romeo for potentially spending the night with Rosalind. But Romeo corrects him and responds that actually, no, he was talking to Juliet and how they're in love and how they want to get married. And the reason Romeo has gone to see him is that Romeo is there to ask if Friar Lawrence would be willing to marry him and Juliet later that afternoon. And Friar Lawrence has a rather interesting response to this. He does not really seem to approve of this decision, mainly because he doesn't seem to think that Romeo is taking this decision seriously, or that he's truly in love. Specifically, he mentions how it was not long ago that Romeo was just totally entranced by Rosalind and just head over heels in love with her. And now, just like that, he's immediately just in love and fascinated with, and the word, I had a good word and I can't remember it. I can't think of it now. But the Romeo is head over heels in love with Juliet now, like just like that, just immediately. Oh, I'm not in love with Rosalind anymore. I'm in love with Juliet. And Friar Lawrence looks at that and kind of seems to imply that the fact that Romeo was able to move on so quickly shows that he was not truly in love with Rosalind, and that also shows that he's probably not truly in love with Juliet. And that in Friar Lawrence's opinion, he thinks that Romeo's attraction to Juliet is not love. He just thinks that she's pretty, and that's why he's interested in her. specifically, he mentions how he has a line of something like young men's love lies not in their hearts but in their eyes, implying that Romeo, again, is not truly in love with somebody. He's just fascinated and enamored with girls that he thinks are pretty. And now that he thinks Juliet's prettier than Rosalind, he's now all in on Juliet because he thinks that she's the prettiest. But he does agree to marry the two. And this decision, he explains why, how even though he doesn't think this is a smart match or as a good relationship, he still says that he will marry them because he hopes it will end. He hopes that by creating a marriage alliance between the Montagues and the Capulets, it will end the feud between their houses and get their parents to stop hating each other. But he definitely has some misgivings. Scene 4 then starts with Benvolio and Mercutio talking about how Romeo did not go home the previous night, and how because of that he has not seen the letter that has been sent to the Montagues that morning from Tybalt. So Tybalt is still very angry about Romeo and the Montagues crashing the Capulets' party the previous night. And Tybalt has sent Romeo a letter formally challenging him to a duel. And Mercutio remarks that Tybalt is an expert swordsman and that if Romeo accepts the challenge, it's going to be a difficult fight. But it's at that moment that Romeo appears and comes in. And at that point, Mercutio and Romeo have a fun back and forth. It's kind of a battle of wits based on just silly, nonsensical wordplay and metaphors and stuff. And at the conclusion of this, Mercutio remarks that Romeo is kind of back to his old self. He's not whiny, he's not moping or depressed like he was in Act 1, but that Romeo, basically, he says something along the lines of Romeo is Romeo again. That basically, he's back to his old self and the way he was before he got his heart broken by Rosalind. But again, Mercutio and Benvolio do not know about Juliet, so they don't know why Romeo is so happy and has had this mood change. But they can tell that something's different. In that moment, the nurse arrives, being sent by Juliet. So Juliet sent the nurse to go talk to Romeo and find out what the situation is regarding their wedding. And before the nurse can get Romeo off by himself to ask him about this, Mercutio makes some pretty crude and crass and very offensive remarks about the nurse, many of them of a sexual nature, before he goes away, and the nurse is very much offended. But when she and Romeo are alone, she first takes a moment, rather interestingly, to give Romeo a pretty stern warning or talking to, where she basically tells him, like, she says something along the lines of, like, you better not be playing a trick on Juliet. You better not be manipulating her or trying to use her. You better be dead serious that you want to marry her. Because if you're not serious, if this is like a game to you or just a fling to you, and that you're taking advantage of this girl, then she basically says she tells him that, like, you're basically a scumbag if you do that, which is rather interesting. It shows that the nurse has a lot of maternal feeling for Juliet, and how the nurse, even though she's not technically Juliet's mother, is very much a mother figure for her. And the nurse almost seems to view Juliet as a surrogate daughter for her, which makes sense because, again, the nurse was the woman who effectively raised Juliet, and it makes sense why she would care about her so much. So, again, it's kind of interesting. You really get to see through that warning how much the nurse cares and is looking at how much she cares about and is looking out for Juliet's best interest in this situation. And it seems that he seems to share Friar Lawrence's view that this might not be the best decision they could be making. But Romeo assures the nurse that no, he is serious, and he tells her the plan that basically he needs the nurse to go and tell Juliet to tell her parents that she's going to go to confession that afternoon, which will give her an excuse to go to see Friar Lawrence alone. While she is there, she will marry Romeo. And again, that will give her an excuse to get out of the house to marry him. Romeo also tells the nurse that while he and Juliet are getting married, he is sending one of his servants to the nurse to give her a rope ladder to give to Juliet, which will give Romeo a way to basically Rapunzel his way or climb his way up into her bedroom. Scene 4 comes to the end when the nurse briefly talks about Paris. So the nurse mentions that it seems that Juliet did, in fact, meet Paris at the feast the previous night, and that she doesn't really like him all that much, even though the nurse seems very much enamored with him and is definitely encouraging Juliet to go and marry Paris. The nurse straight up says that she believes that Paris is the better match and will be a better husband for her than Romeo will. But she also mentions that Juliet seems to have a lot of dread at the thought of having to marry Paris, which is a rather interesting notion that gets developed a bit later on in the play. And that brings us to scene 5, which starts with Juliet by herself, anxiously awaiting the return of the nurse. So we learn that Juliet sent the nurse out at 9 o'clock that morning, and the nurse told her that she would be back in half an hour with a message from Romeo, and that it's now been 3 hours since the nurse left, so she is running very, very late. Juliet is freaking out and getting very anxious and nervous about what the situation is when the nurse returns, and the nurse exacerbates her frustration by complaining about how tired and sore and out of breath she is about having to run around all day, and how she was offended and insulted by Mercutio, and how she still thinks Paris is a better choice than Romeo. A bit of comic relief there, again, reinforcing the notion that the nurse is a comic relief character meant to provide some humor. But the nurse does eventually tell Juliet that Romeo is waiting for her with Friar Lawrence to get married, and Juliet immediately heads off to go get married. When that brings us to scene 6, the last scene of Act 2, which starts with Romeo and Friar Lawrence waiting for Juliet. Friar Lawrence comments how he still has misgivings about this. He'll still go through it, but he still has misgivings about it. And Juliet arrives, and he takes them off to get married. And that's the end of Act 2. So, again, a lot happens. A lot has been developed here in this act. And what I think is important to bear in mind is that there's a lot of what's called dramatic irony going on in this act. Dramatic irony is a literary term. It refers to a situation where the audience or the reader knows more than the characters in the story do. So there's a lot of that going on here, meaning that we, the audience or the reader, know more than most of the characters in this play do, because most of the characters in this play, all but 2 of them, are unaware that Romeo and Juliet are a couple and are unaware that Romeo and Juliet have gotten married. Friar Lawrence and the nurse are the only 2 characters in this play that know about Romeo and Juliet's relationship. So that gives us, the audience, as well, a privileged position, because we, unlike most of the other characters, know about the relationship between Romeo and Juliet. So that adds some more conflict and makes this more interesting for us. And then also helps explain why, like, for example, Mercutio and Benvolio are a bit confused about why Romeo is now all happy, because they don't know that he's met Juliet, and they don't know he's gotten over Rosalind. So That's confusing. And also, again, another instance of dramatic irony. Unlike Romeo and Juliet, we know that Tybalt wants to fight Romeo. Romeo does not know that Tybalt wants to fight him yet. So that's another interesting situation. And we get, again, continuing development in Act 3 where things get developed a bit more in the next act. So there's my rundown of Act 2. Your Act 2 quiz will open on Friday. If you have any questions, email me. If you have any missing work and you want credit for it, that also needs to be in by Friday night. I'm not accepting work from third quarter next quarter. So get that in if you have late work and you want credit for it. Otherwise, it's going to stay a 0. But with all that being said, take care, guys, and I will talk to you later.